conversation shifts not to white bodies in violent disarray, but to bodies of color in violent disarray. If you look at the cover of my book, and if you can find it on your mobile device, you'll see this crowd of people who are actually chasing one Black man. This is a depiction from the Detroit Riots in 1943, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. The second part of that ritual, as you think about how to shift this violence onto other bodies, is this act of white racialized utilization. Now, you've heard utilization before, usually in communities not in the West, where there's a violent, a keening at an emotional moment. It may celebrate, it may be a mourning. It's a call for an emotional fever pitch. And white racialized utilization, what you'll see is a buildup to a fever pitch where one has to wrest control away from the violating Black, brown, and other bodies of color because white supremacy is seen as being endangered. I'll define it for you, and you'll see that definition if you have the book on page 24. It is the urgent vocalization of threats to white supremacist order designed to elicit a corrective and often violent response. We've seen some of that violence over the last year, but I wanted to actually bring to mind a couple of other things. At the center of the racialized violence in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, we see the weaponry of war. That technology was the Gatling gun. We see others in the riot events that I discuss in the book, where the militarization of the police is an important part of the concept, so that actually the weaponry of war is turned against these violating bodies of color. And these bodies of color, there's always a body at the center. And often that body is defined as something that is dehumanized, very large, very strong, very violent, very sexual. This is one of the reasons that if you watch the opening prosecuting remarks of the Derek Chauvin case, you'll notice they spent an inordinate amount of time simply calling our attention to the fact that George Floyd was a human. There's also important things to note about the media in riot making, the media and other social channels. In the 19th century, there were many broadsides published about Negro rule and the threat of Negro domination. It appeared in the print media. You see that going through the through line through all the events that I mentioned, and the social media of the day and this day. In 1898 in Wilmington, in fact, one of the things that happened in the utilization was a request that all white pastors read a specific narrative from their pulpits. It was Jeremiah 25 verses 34 through 36. I'll read the King James Version so you'll have exactly what these white pastors were asked to read. Howl, you shepherds, and cry, and wallow yourselves in the ashes, you principal of the flock. For the days of your slaughter and your dispersions are accomplished, and ye shall fall like a pleasant vessel. And the shepherds shall have no way to flee, nor the principal of the flock to escape. A voice of the cry of the shepherds and a howling of the principal of the flock shall be heard, for the Lord hath spoiled their pasture. This was a literal call to arms. And you see in the narrative that Wilmington was actually closed. Black people were asked, particularly the middle class, were asked to leave, and the borders were closed. The Black body at the center of that unrest was a man named Alexander Manley that we'll talk about a little bit more when we get through. And all around this is the social urgency to preserve white order, white rule, and white supremacy. Click it one more time first, Karen, so we can move ahead. On the other side of that is resistance and reclamation. Often it's accomplished through protests and demonstration, the like of which you have seen, through protest narratives that might include historical fiction, film, or other kinds of protest, media, again, and social channels, involving the Black or other minority and alternative presses, the Black ethnic church space or the spiritual space, and parallel social institutions that were created so that there could be support for these communities. As importantly, and I think will be at the center of everything we see in my comments today and that we've seen unfold in the issues around George Floyd, is the role of citizen documentarians. And that can happen in photographs or video. And we know very well that at the center of the prosecution against George Floyd was this video, the many videos that were taken by citizens. I've included a couple of graphics on this slide just to demonstrate We should all by now be familiar with the capes and hoods of the KKK. We're becoming more familiar with new white supremacist organizations like the Proud Boys and Q, all of which have been on the FBI watch for racial violence. And if you can, Karen, you might not be able to go back, but if you can, please do. And we'll see more of these narratives. At the bottom of the previous slide, I've also included an image of Oakland. Again, the city of Oakland is boarded up today, but what's been captured in the protests around the murders of George Floyd and so many others have been captured in mural projects downtown as the buildings were boarded up, and they change quite frequently. If I were to show you a close-up of this particular mural, you would notice the faces and names of many of the fallen who have gone by the wayside, many whose names are not called regularly in these protests, but who are remembered in these murals over and over again. So now we can click forward. So I'm going to start with talking about what the book covers. The book covers some episodes of racialized violence that follows this ritual process. I'll start with the Wilmington Race Riot of 1898. What you see here is clearly a depiction of white men with guns and a burning building in the midst of what was a coup, a takeover of the government of Wilmington. Wilmington was of particular interest because of its large Black middle class. There were servant leaders there. The population of Blacks in Wilmington was quite large for most cities, and they were quite successful. This racialized humiliation started around August of 1898 with the publication of an editorial by a white woman named Rebecca Felton. Some people herald her as a proto-feminist. I can't do that. One of the things she published in her narrative, in her editorial, that was picked up by the AP Wire, was the fact that all Black men roaming the countryside free were a threat to white women, and they should be hanged, no questions asked. This was a part of an ongoing narrative about the damnation and domination of Negroes during a time when there clearly was no Negro domination. What there was a political shift. In the preceding elections in 1894 and 1896, the Fusion Party, which was an integrated party, was winning all statewide elections. So this was literally a coup to bring power back to the Republican Party. Josephus Daniels, if you followed any of the school renaming, building renaming conversations around the country, his name is actually being removed from my alma mater, North Carolina State. The Daniels building has stood in memory to his work, but he was the leader of the white supremacist campaign during that time. This editorial was responded to by Alexander Manley, who was Black, but who was not identifiably so, was actually the editor of the Black press in Wilmington, The Record. He bought his press literally from the white newspaper editors in the area. They actually burned down the newspaper office during this time as well. And there was concern that the press had not been completely paid for, even though they burned it down. Now, I said he was not identifiably Black. He appeared to be a white man. And so one of the things that was happening during the unrest in the Wilmington Race Riot was that white rioters stopped his wagon, told them that they were looking for that Negro, and they used a different term, Alexander Manley. And do you have a gun? Because if you see him, shoot him. And they gave him a gun to look for himself. He responded to this Fulton editorial by recognizing the fact that what she said was not realistic. There was not Negro domination. And in fact, many relationships that were cross-racial were relationships by choice. And so that, though, became the linchpin for the violence that ensued. As I indicated previously, the militia brought in a Gatling gun and literally shot people in the streets of Wilmington. One of the other things that you'll see coming out of the White Riot narrative is a refusal of the powers in place to actually name how many people died in the riot event. What we do have is an interesting example of one of the bodies at the center with Alexander Manley, and that was a Black man who they shot down for his role in defending himself, and he took 300 shots. The only reason why we know about him is because he survived for 5 days, and they found that to be noteworthy. And so this narrative continues. If you click forward one time, Karen, I'll talk a little bit about Soweto in 1976. The Black body that became depicted at the scene is little 13-year-old Hector Peterson, whom you see carried in the arms of his classmate with his sister by his side. What was happening in Soweto in 1976 was a crackdown against protests against the apartheid regime. In 1976, the South African government passed a new law, the Internal Security Amendment Act, number 79. And this act made it possible for the government to detain detainees without authorization and without cause for an unlimited amount of time. What it became operational was that tanks and the weaponry of war were visited in the Black communities, and Soweto included, and people were arrested because of their protests against the apartheid regime. That policing is a part of the weaponry of war that I talked about before, about this militarization. On June the 16th, a group of school children, middle schoolers and high schoolers, about tens of thousands of them, gathered in Soweto to protest the fact that education was now going to be shifted from English and their traditional languages to Afrikaans, which was the language of the apartheid regime. The result was that war was unleashed and 13-year-old Hector Peterson was killed. Again, in this event, thank you, Peepers, for joining me. Again, in this event, there's a reluctance to indicate how many people died in the process. I then look at a couple of other events. Karen, if you could flip forward, not once, but twice this time. And that is the beating of Rodney King and what was called the LA Uprising that precipitated from it in 1992. The video of Rodney King began airing around March the 7th of 1991. It was taken by happenstance as a bystander looked down from his apartment. His name was George Holliday, to play with his new video camera. Alongside the footage of his beating was a black cat, some footage that he had shot of Arnold Schwarzenegger. But he captured this entire scene, which included many, many bystanders driving by and doing nothing. The black body at the center of this, of course, is Rodney King. And one of the things that we have coming out, you'll see some similarities also with the George Floyd murder. One of the things that Stacey Kuhn, the officer, the ranking officer in charge, said on the witness stand was that the reason he had to be beaten so relentlessly was because he was making sexually suggestive gyrations and getting up every time. And by the way, he was on angel dust. Again, you see another similarity. When the trial was moved to largely white Simi Valley and all four of the officers charged were acquitted, what resulted in was the LA Rising. That became the riot, but in effect, that violence had happened long before the LA Uprising. Let's click forward one time for one other view. Karen, thank you. What you see here, I'm sorry if it's triggering to some, is the bodies of men in South Africa. This took place in Mabatho, which is in the Bantustan called Bapututswana. So let me explain that. In the 1970s, South Africa also decided that no Black person should be considered a citizen of the country. And so they created these Bantustans. And so though you were born in South Africa and that was your home, instead of being a citizen of South Africa, you were a citizen of a Bantustan, a Black area. And so what was happening in March of 1994 was the roll up to the first all race elections as apartheid was becoming dismantled. The men that you see here were a part of a convoy of 18 vehicles. They were driving a blue Mercedes. They were going to this Bantustan to address the Black people who were in protest there. What we see is an embedded reporter, a white reporter who happened to be there. This convoy approached the crowd. They shot into the crowd, killing a woman and injuring many others. And then we have this quote, "Suddenly, a fierce gun battle erupted. All but the blue Mercedes escaped." And we see these men who went to defend white supremacy, who actually engaged in shooting, killing one and injuring others, being depicted as victims of their own actions. What I found very interesting was that as this was being reported on NBC, after they told the story of what happened in Mabatho, the story ends thusly. Meanwhile, outside of the homeland, the Bantustan, And inside of South Africa, there was black on black violence at a political rally. It always has to be blamed somewhere else. Click forward one more time, and I think you'll see that everybody should be familiar with this scene from the Capitol uprising as the Confederate flag is taken into the rotunda of the Capitol. We all know that that resulted in 5 deaths. And this is a part of a long journey of this approach that we have to white riots. I'm going to mention a couple more before we go through the slide. I told you that the cover depicted something from the Detroit Riots of 1943. What was going on in Detroit was a massive movement to Detroit for people to work in the auto plants, an opportunity for an economic future differently from what they had before. The difficulty was whites in that area did not want blacks to be involved. This violence also happened because whites went to a black neighborhood and they killed in 36 hours. Let me restate that. In 36 hours, 34 people were killed. 25 of them are black. 17 were killed by the police in this event. 1,800 people were arrested, but the majority of them were black people. 13 murders are still unresolved from this riot event. If you look up pictures of the 1943 riots, you will see smiling white people with beaten bodies of black people between them, bodies laying in front of white mobs. But this was depicted as a race riot. Let me read what the mayor said as this was unfolding. Mayor Jeffries praised the police and said he was, quote, rapidly losing patience with those Negro leaders who insisted their people do not and will not trust policemen. So this is an ongoing narrative that should be quite familiar with us today. I'll also mention Tulsa, largely because many people are just discovering Tulsa and the violence that occurred there from The Watchmen and the film Lovecraft, the series Lovecraft Country. If you know the great historians have focused on this event for a very long time. It happened between May 31st and June 1st in 1921. This area of Tulsa was a black and very progressive area. There were black banks, there were those supporting black businesses. It was a successful part of town. What happened though, occurred just after rumors started about a black man riding on an elevator with a white woman. None of those rumors were true, but what it resulted in was white rioters going to the Greenwood section, they looted and they burned. The National Guard were called in not to control the white rioters, but to actually capture any black people they saw around, and they held them for many as long as 8 days. 36 deaths were reported. That's a miracle because Tulsa was actually firebombed by the local government during that time. Again, if you look at that pictures, you'll see the extremity of the violence that was visited there. And 36 deaths were reported. A recent panel that was brought forth in 2001 said that at least 300 people died in that event. And the Tulsa riot, they found, the Oklahoma Commission found, and I quote, the city had conspired with the mob of white citizens against black citizens. So let's move forward in the slides, if you would. So I wanted to think about these things in reference to the June insurrection that happened at the Capitol. And I've put a quote here from the book that I think by now you will see how it operates. For people who embrace white supremacy and its attendant privileges, the endings of decades, centuries, and millennia prompt discussions of societal failures, of technological treacheries, of expanding an uncontrollable population of racial others, and of a disquietness that signals an impending apocalypse, that then this ululation asks those who embrace white supremacy to do something about. Karen, if you could click forward 3 times. Look at how this insurrection, this white riot, has been described over and over again. You rarely see it described as a white riot, even in the documentation leading up to the arrest of some of the people there. We need only look at images of the people who were moved forward for Trump's photo op, who were protesting peacefully, who were moved out of the way forcefully, to see the difference and how these different bodies were handled in this situation. Karen, if you click forward twice. Another quote for the book, and I think an image that's apt. Racial violence involving whites is never identified as a riot event, even in the face of historical and documentary evidence that exposes them as such. In this context, white riot is validated and characterized as rebellion, as civic duty, as revolution, and the like, because the cultural tempers of the United States and South Africa have already prefigured racial violence as being a Black act. I will say that some news media are actually calling it a white riot, but it is still rare. Click forward once for me, if you would, Karen. Here's some things to consider. The white rioters were allowed to leave the Capitol without being arrested. As we know, the Capitol Police were restrained from responding. The deployment of the National Guard was delayed because the bodies at the center were not those rioting Black bodies or brown bodies or other bodies of color. And while 5 people were killed, hundreds more were injured, and yet only 540 suspects were charged to date. So we can see the difference even in how operationalizing in the law following these events, there's a vast difference. Click forward once more for me, Karen. Thank you so much for doing that for me. I decided to pull from the headlines a couple things for us to consider in our Q&A. The first, Virginia police officers threatened, pepper sprayed an Army officer during a stop. His name is Canon Nazareno, who is Black and Latino, says his constitutional rights were violated. Part of the thing that you'll see happening more and more are these conversations. You've seen it unfold at this time about driving while Black, walking while Black, operating by Black, picnicking while Black, barbecuing by Black. And this is one example of the ways in which this utilization becomes depicted in the real life experience of the Black and brown people in the middle of it. The second headline, Kim Porter, the officer who killed Dante Wright just a few miles away from where George Floyd died, was charged with second-degree manslaughter. One of the things she says is she thought she had her gun instead of her taser. But we do know that her duty belt was set up in such a way that they should have been easily recognized. The shape of the gun, the weight of the gun, and is quite different from the shape and the weight of the taser. And she shot several times. It wasn't one shot that killed this 20-year-old father and took him from his family. And so you'll have to look at the ways in which these things are sort of contextualized at this very critical moment in our history. The next headline. The fence rests in the case of the officer killed, the ex-cop killing George Floyd. I could not be more thankful that the verdict came out the way it did. But for those of you who think this is an end, please don't mistake. There will be other action. There will certainly be some appeals. We might not be at the end of this. And while several cities have prepared for violence that they thought would come because the verdict might be not guilty, we might also need to be prepared for the kind of white violence that we saw in the Capitol, again, calling in response to the white utilization that existed the entire time that Trump was in office. I'd also like to call your attention to the fact that the Black body at the center of the Black or bodies of color at the center are not always the bodies of males. This was particularly resonant for me. 250 women have been fatally shot by police since 2015. And like Breonna Taylor, 89 of them killed at their homes or residences where they sometimes stayed. This is something you have to really think about. I was really grateful to hear in the aftermath of the trial verdicts today that there was going to be some demonstrations about the fact that women whose names many of we do not have are also a part of this. And I also call your attention to the most recent shooting, that of Adam Toledo, who was killed. The body cam footage of the 13-year-old was released. He was 13 years old and killed on March the 29th in Chicago. We do know that he apparently threw a gun down. It was not in his presence when he was shot by the officer who was in pursuit. So we have this 13-year-old, hands up, no gun. Let me ask you to contrast that image with that of the image from Kenosha when Kyle Rittenhouse went at 17 years old, driven to the area to defend white businesses during the protests about the murders that happened around George Floyd and others, shot 2 people, walked down the street unmolested, in front of police and nothing was done. So we do have to be aware of these differences as we see how bodies are depicted and handled under the law. And that's one of the ways in which I hope when Whites Riots will have an abiding legacy, because it opens the door for these discussions. Let's move forward one more time, please, Karen. You're almost out of the hot seat. So I wanted to end my conversation with a quote later in the book. The legacy of apartheid turns on white privilege and misinforms the rhetoric of cultural supremacy. In order to endorse white privilege and to validate corroborating images, such as that of the white male as a beleaguered minority, keep in mind, we've heard this a lot of late. In truth, though, there can be no conclusion to this project as long as the tie that binds American and South African cultures, oops, typo, is racial violence. There won't be a typo in the book if you have a chance to read it. So I want to pause now and see if we can be in conversation. And again, I'm so grateful for this opportunity to talk about the life of this book that started 20 years ago. Thank you so much for your time.
And thank you so much for your time, Sheila, because that was an amazing talk. And also, it's a really great read. If anybody has an opportunity to get a copy of it, if you are a student or a staff or faculty member at HNU, the HNU Library does have a copy of When Whites Riot. It's an ebook. We will also be sharing some other books that are relevant to this topic, including things that are mentioned in the book, like The Marrow Tradition by Charles Chestnut and others. For those of you that have been joining us, this is being recorded. So if you missed anything, you're going to be able to catch up later. We'll send everything to everybody at the very end. And if you do have any questions, we have our friend Michaela, who's a student employee at HNU Library, who's moderating the chat. So I guess something that I'm going to ask, because it was one thing when I was reading through the book that I had to get some clarification on, a Gatling gun. What is that? It's an automatic weapon, right?
Yes, it was one of the first automatic weapons. Those of you who are fans of Westerns have seen the Gatling gun. It's a big circular sort of mini cannon that has a line of bullets that it follows through, and it usually has a crank on the side. And so the people who brought it to Wilmington was a white militia group, and they brought it to Wilmington in preparation before this violence took place. At the same time, they stopped selling any kind of guns to people of color. It was very difficult for them to get guns, and often very difficult for them to leave, even as they saw this violence approaching. So it's critical to think about the analogous situations in which we have automatic weapons, tanks that went through the streets of Soweto and other Black areas in South Africa, where the military turns, the apparatus of the military turns on the citizenry. So it's important to think about that. This has been happening over the many decades, usually after wars end, when there's excess military gear. Often they are put into hands of municipalities, into hands of the police, and we're aware of the open policing that takes place in Black, Brown, and other communities of color. Thanks for that question, Karen.
Of course. It was definitely something that gave me pause, because then I had to think about like the premeditation of it, but also like you're saying, like it's a weapon that you have to crank, and sort of, going into that process. I think about the recognizing that you are killing these people and having to like have sort of like a thought process behind it, where now I feel like they're with the weaponry, but even with social media or with anything else, it is kind of like thoughtless the way that you can have a weapon without realizing consequences, if that makes sense.
Exactly. And the most important thing about the deployment of this automatic weapon in Wilmington is that there was nothing akin to it at the time. And it was directed at people who were ordinary citizens, children. Part of the violence took place outside of a school for Black children. It is said that people fainted in the street just from hearing the cries and seeing the violence. And again, the numbers, one of the white press published said they would never reveal the number of people who were killed during that time. And many of them were killed by these automatic weapons. I will say that it's important to note that the people who are on the side of the right are not just in black and white. In Wilmington, one of the white owners of a manufacturing firm, that's the front building still sits on the waterfront in Wilmington, downtown Wilmington. You can see it. They defended their black employees against the mob and held them there until it was safe for them to go home.
Leah says, thank you for this relevant presentation. It is critical that we continue to engage in conversations that contextualize recent events within the backdrop of history, which I agree with. And Seneca says, I'd like to hear more of your thoughts on January 6th, especially the defiance of Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for that question, Seneca, and for your comments, Leah. You might have heard that Maxine Waters is now becoming a body at the center of this conversation. They now want to censor her for her incendiary comments that they would continue their protest during the time we were waiting for this decision to come down. And yet we see Hawley and others not only being engaged in the process, but we also see that clearly the white rioters who overtook the Capitol had inside information. We also see clearly that they had their marching orders. They were looking for specific people to kill. They were looking for specific people to bring to lynch justice, including Nancy Pelosi and even Vice President Mike Pence. People actually had to shelter in place from what was a murderous mob. And yet we have people who have never been censored, who have defended the violence, who were a part not only of the ululation that led up to it, but very likely a part of the planning process and the unfolding of it. So I think if we're extending this conversation from the book to these current events, those things can't be missed. And we're still in the midst of that. Thank you, Seneca. That's really an important conversation to have. And again, just as in the conversations about the men in Mambato, it turned to black on black violence instead of actually acting on the many calls to bring the Republicans and others involved in this who are sitting in Congress to justice. We are now turning to Maxine Waters because she cannot be allowed to say, we'll continue the protest while we keep the pressure on while we wait for these verdicts.
We've got two questions. There's one in the chat from Maria Elena, but I see Ben has his hand up and waiting so patiently. Ben, you can unmute yourself if you'd like to speak.
I was saying,
hi, Ben.
Hi.
Hello, Prof. Can you hear me? Am I clear?
I certainly can. So good to see you.
It's good to see you all. I just want to make a comment about the question on the Gatling gun.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'm a veteran, and anytime I read, I've already read that book, and when it comes into what comes into mind is that the fear of people even seeing that gun. Now, that was the beginning of the automatic rifle, and that is something that you don't use it for crowd control. In case of anything, it has to be like for actual warfare against external attack. So for bringing it alone into Wilmington for something like this, the fear and people hearing the sound of it alone was something that was so, dehumanizing to the Black people and how the Black, race and the body has been reduced to. Okay, so it's like they can do anything regardless of, whatever the outcome was, just for the fear. Now, looking at what happened during the 13-year-old that was killed in Chicago, that was holding a weapon, assuming he was holding a weapon, but we didn't see anything. We saw a police officer running after him. You're talking about pistol, okay, pistol that he was holding, assuming. Now you have a young guy who went out there trying to protect people. The one that said, oh, I went out there trying to protect people's property. Mm-hmm. He was holding AR-11, okay, AR-11 automatic rifle in front of the soldiers. And this white young kid, nobody questioned him. So you take these two things. We're talking about something that happened, in Wilmington over the years. And we are in 2021, and we have this same disparity going on. So it's just something that when we think we are making progress, and one of these things just raises, ugly head, and then you go back to see, like, are we making progress or are we retrogressing? But as long as we keep fighting for the right thing, we will have people that will come to the knowledge of it, that will, have the understanding as to how to move forward for a better world for us all. So I just
Thank you
wanted to
so much
comment.
for that, Ben. That's such an important conversation to have. And let's extend that a little bit to talk about Tamir Rice, 12 years old, with a toy gun in a park and killed. No questions asked. His sister was also brutalized as she tried to reach him before he died. 12 years old. And so the difference between the actions of what happens to a 12-year-old holding a toy gun in a public park to a young man walking down the street with an automatic rifle cannot be ignored. So thank you so much for that. And I also think it extends a conversation that we had when Tim Tyson was our guest here at Holy Names. He talked about the political issues at play. His book, Democracy Betrayed, also takes a look at Wilmington from a different point of view, but he talked about the politics of the fusion party. Ben, you and I have talked a lot about the dangers of a two-party system, of a pendulum that swings back and forth time and time again. And so that's also a part of a very political conversation. So glad you could join us today.
Sure.
And Trudy, I see your hand up, but we're going to go to Maria Elena very quickly, and then to you, and then down to Robert. Maria Elena says, can you speak more about the role of citizen documentarians? Is the fact we are so reliant on citizens for documenting these cases of violence an indication that the media and other institutions have failed? And for example, there are no public health statistics on police violence.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that is a wonderful question. I wouldn't say that the media have failed. We do have some failures that are operating, but the media itself have not failed. What do we do with the Fox News, for instance, on a network that also provides us with entertainment and comedy and football and sports? I mean, what do you do with the dissonance there? Alongside of that, you have other more liberal-leaning spaces like MSNBC and CNN. So these conversations themselves are not failures. Where we are failing is we're not having conversations around news that is not as tilted as it is in these environments. Many of those who are my age and more ancient may remember Walter Cronkite, who would tell both sides of any story. But now we have a news media that's more skewed. We also have a proliferation of news media outlets that are designed to meet particular audiences. And we add to that social media channels that admit others and not some others. So I wouldn't say it's failed. I would say that the conversation continues, but the importance of the citizen documentation that witness, without it, George Floyd's case would have never gone to trial. Without it, the evidence would not be in hand. We also have other documentation available that has been completely ignored. So one of the things you might ask yourself is what was the reason that George Floyd was on this earth? Or was it to change the world, as his daughter was seen saying as she was trying to mourn his death? My daddy changed the world. Has he changed the world? Will these conversations continue? But I'd say that the only reason it's continued is because of that independent citizen voice that continues to be a possibility. So what I would also say that we might be mindful of is we need to look at legislation that might be coming forward to limit the possibilities of these citizen witness narratives being a part of any court narrative moving forward. And that's something that we should look at, because many of these laws will be passed insidiously and they won't really matter until they affect a process where we won't be able to see what the citizen documentarian has offered.
And Trudier, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name.
Trudia.
Trudia.
Yes, hey Sheila.
Hi, Trudier. Thank you so much for joining today. Without Trudier, I would not be. So thank you so much for being
Not
here, my
exactly,
mentor.
but anyway, I was thinking when you talk about Tulsa, John Hope Franklin is the name that the famed historian. When you think in 1921 to 2021, and we, in that 100-year stretch, all of these horrible things that have been happening, I'm going to turn the conversation slightly in a different direction to ask about strategies for avoiding despair. Within African-American communities, this is so heavy. It just weighs you down all the time. And my sister and I talk about that a lot. You know, how do you just, obviously we have kept going, but what do you see as the best ways that we might continue to do that to avoid despairing?
Oh, Trudy, what a wonderful question.
Mhm.
I've had these difficult conversations over and over again in my classrooms and my conversations professionally. And self-care is really an important part of that. Although it's disparaged a great deal, I think the Black Lives Matter movement was an attempt at self-care to just say at minimum, can we use the word matter to recognize that we have substance, that we are human. We see how that has been dismantled. And I think we all have to have our own personal journeys in which we sort of balance the times that we're out on the street or contributing to a bail for people who are arrested because we can't be out on the street, or offering some sort of support as we move through. I can't be on the streets like I once was, Trudier, and but we can support in other ways. And so you have to find a way that you can contribute, and then you have to find the spaces where you heal. I make no secret of the fact that I'm a Reiki master teacher. I use Reiki on myself. I believe that healing is in the world and however you access it. But the most important thing is human relationship and the recognition that these are painful things, and that the only thing that can move that forward is some aspect of love. Maybe that love for you is communing with your friends, of walking together in a protest, of writing a book, of futuring this work in your own individual way. But I think love is the ultimate self-care, and it's so important. It makes me think about your article, This Disease Called Strength, which is also an abiding legacy for so many of us.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
It makes me think so much too. And I'm sorry if I'm going to interject with my own question, Sheila, but just with self-care, but also in your book, you talk so much about the creative reactions to history and how, like with Charles Chestnut, for example, writing Marrow of Tradition and others, I feel like that creativity can also be such a healing accomplishment in order to give light and credence to things that are really damaging for people. And to also give, I think also to give space to have a great conversation. Do you think that was something that really influenced the research that you were doing, or that continues to influence research that you do when writing about things like White Riot, for example?
Oh, certainly. You know, every scholar thinks that they're going to write the book that's going to be a seminal text about something. Many of them only reach a small audience. Some of them have a long shelf life. Most of them we feature in our classrooms and hope to bring that message for our students. And those who are writing in the critical space are also performing an act of memory that we would not have otherwise. I'll go back to Chestnut to tell the audience a little bit about his work. He was also, like Alex Manley, not identifiably Black. He embraced his Blackness, but he had several grandparents who were white. His middle name, Waddell, comes from one of his white grandparents. They were part of a group of mixed race people who identified as white in North Carolina and later in Ohio. He passed the bar when he took it in Ohio with the highest score, I think around 1895, 1896, somewhere in that area. But he was denied admittance into the bar because he was a Black man. Now, again, he was not visibly a Black man, but he was identified as such. So what he did instead was to become a reporter, and he addressed things in that light, but he also addressed things in his fiction, which always turned on this idea of race awareness and how we evolve as humans to embrace our differences. So those of you gathered here today who have not read Charles Chestnut, he's a great read. Anytime you pick him up, you can access his short stories, many of them online. Much of his work can be accessed online, but I greatly recommend The Mayor of Tradition, which, by the way, was published only a few years after the violence in Wilmington, and he was closely connected to it. He had an uncle who lived in the area. He was very closely connected to it. He also knew a Black doctor who lived in Wilmington who survived this violence. And I believe that the doctor at the center of this story was based on that doctor that he personally knew. He never wavered from this course, despite the fact that he could have lived a life of a white man and he chose not to.
And I'll add also that if people are interested in reading Mayor of Tradition, it is digitized for free on Internet Archive and also the Hattie Trust. So no need to go to your public library to look for it. We also have several copies of Chestnut's short stories at the library if you're an HNU faculty member, staff, or student. And Patsy has her hand raised, so I'm going to go to her next.
Thank you so much.
I see people in the chat too, so we will get to you soon.
Thank you so much. First of all, I'd like to thank Holy Names University for giving my little sister a forum to talk about her book, which I told her needs to be republished with an edition, because we're still living in these times. And one of the things I think the question Trudier asked was about what gives you hope. And what gives me hope, still living in North Carolina, in the South, and I travel to Wilmington, and as much as I love the beaches, you can feel the underlying darkness of the things that took place there. You can feel it. But I am unusual, I think, in the sense that I will position myself in spaces that a lot of Black people will not. I have people who happen to be white who are also my dear friends, but I also don't mind, basically, like we used to say back in the day, speaking truth to power. I'm in a Bible study, for example, in a very conservative Baptist, right-wing, people who only watch Fox News church. But I feel like I'm there for a reason. They need to hear the other side of the coin. And we had a discussion on Monday night, and we were talking about something. We were talking about Joseph and forgiving his brothers for having, done all that they did to him and everything. And one of my Bible study small group leaders mentioned something about racism and how it was affecting things. I said, well, let's call a spade a spade. Racism is what? Sin. There's no way around it. If you look at it like that, you can deal with it like that. So some people would not put themselves in a position where they were in a very extreme minority. But I'm very vocal at this church because, again, I feel like they need to know that the little bubble, the little Fox News bubble they're living in is not the real world. The other thing that gives me hope is after the George Floyd murder, there were eruptions all over the world, including in Raleigh, North Carolina, which was boarded up, by the way, in anticipation of the verdict going the wrong way. And it's still boarded up right now. But young people, Black, white, red, yellow, every race and hue were out in the streets because they know that it's just not right. Even if they were raised differently, if their parents were living in a dream world, living in the past, whatever it is, these young people have very clear vision of what is right and what is wrong. And they are willing to go to the mat and go to the street to fight for it. And there were young white kids who pulled down the Confederate statues in Raleigh, North Carolina that I've had to walk past my whole life. And I don't miss them. There are people crying about it right now, but I'm glad they're gone. The other thing that gives me hope is that in light of all that has happened with George Floyd and all these other horrendous, Breonna Taylor, all these horrendous situations that have happened, that are still happening, that are unresolved. And thank God for the verdict today. God is still in control. So people have started.
Patsy, I'm going to thank you and pick up on a couple of things you said that are really important.
One thing, people have started conversations, uncomfortable conversations.
True.
conversations like what we're having here. And even in my community, we have the Nextdoor app. There is a group called We Know Black Lives Matter, and they're asking people to gather to have uncomfortable conversations. Go, Sheila.
We've got to be able to embrace this discomfort. I want to give a shout out to our Holy Name students and to Holy Name's mission, which is a social justice mission. And we attract a very diverse student body, the most diverse student body I've worked at any university ever. But our students have been out on the front lines, making it known that this injustice has to end. And they represent very different kinds of racialized bodies across the board, but they have been very active in this movement. I started a conversation early in the slide about the mural downtown. One of the first times that I went out to document was after the unrest that turned violent in Oakland, just after the George Floyd murder. The entire downtown, the Walgreens was gaping open, the Chase Bank was gaping open. And I would go every week to take pictures because it would change on a weekly basis. And it just brought tears to my eyes when I saw a mural painted Asian Americans for Black Lives Matter. And I just want to say that Black people are not the only people who are violated in this way. But what we see coming up is these groups who are actually speaking out in solidarity with and for each other. And I think that's an important way to heal and hope at this time. Who's next, Karen?
We have a couple. I'm also going to say too, it's about to be 7 o'clock. We are still recording this. I am here to hang out for the extent of this conversation if people want to keep having a conversation, but we did say there was going to be an hour. So if you want to leave, you can leave. That's fine. But I hope that you can stay because we do have several comments in the chat that I'd really like to get to. A lot of these are about social media. And I think that that is sort of relevant because when you wrote this book, it was 20 years ago and social media didn't exist. And I think what's interesting to sort of like read through this book and to think about are the impacts of social media and how it's sometimes used as a weapon. It's sometimes used to create a space to have conversations like we've all identified. But do you think that there would have been something different you would write? Well, if you made an amendment now, if you had a different chapter that you were going to write in this book, what would it be? And do you think that you would talk about social media and how would you talk about it?
I think social media has always existed. It just changes in time and technology. So the social media of the 19th century were the political broadsides. The Library of Congress maintains many of them. You can go in and look and see what they would say. They were quick publications that could be printed overnight and handed out. Those of you who have seen Hamilton have seen that was the social media of the day. What makes our cameras and what we have in our hands, these tiny computers, so important is because they can be rapidly uploaded and disseminated in great distances across these social media platforms. And you're right, it has been weaponized, but it has also been used to galvanize response and galvanize unity and to talk about how we resolve the ongoing issues that exist in our country. If I were going to write another chapter, I'd have to have two. One would have to be on the insurrection and White Riot at the White House. And based on some of the things we've talked about today, this idea of hope is an important thing, even as this conversation continues.
Agreed. And when I remember taking a course in library school about the history of books, and we talked a lot about informational prime movers and how we're in sort of a interesting point in our history where the internet, social media, for example, it's a prime mover of information where we're still trying to understand the capacity of it and how quickly we can inform each other and what to do with it. Similar to printing broadsides like you identified, or being able to print anything, for example, versus like having to write things out. So I think,
And I think there's a platform called, I might have the wrong name of it, Fiverr, where you can publish immediately to the internet space. I would expect that those kinds of things would proliferate, particularly given the cost of publication today, academic or otherwise. But that idea of universal access is certainly appealing and does sort of circumvent this idea of one narrative around these issues of race and violence.
Nikki has a question, or Sylvia.
I just want to say that although we, the library staff, have time to continue the conversation, I want to make sure that Sheila has time to continue the conversation.
Oh, also
I do. I don't want to hold everybody too long, but I will be here as long as there's a question to be asked.
Okay. We just have a few. I think we can probably wrap this up soon. Nikki says, Sheila, do you think the language of protest versus riot involving white people is due in part to a lack of knowledge of history and an unwillingness to engage with history surrounding Black people in general and Black violence? If so, what's one way to increase the opportunity for folks to learn and engage in this knowledge, as well as for students to learn about it, given some institutions are working to dismantle Black studies programs, any course that teaches about such history? And I know, I mean, I went to Mills College, and I think that was like one of the first programs that they dismantled was their ethnic studies program, which is pretty upsetting.
We just created an ethnic studies program, so we're in a different side of that spectrum. But Nikki, thank you so much for that question. I think we have many things at play. I believe that many people, no matter their identity, really want to know more. And in some ways, our educational system becomes gated. If you think about the impact, for instance, of Texas choices in textbooks that have peculiarities that aren't really in line with real history, but because Texas is so large, many of the textbooks have been limited in some way. Because education was segregated, that not only meant that there were different spaces, the curriculum were different and it was limited. And part of this sort of brainwashing around white supremacy is not to know and to be surprised when you do know. So many people are new to anti-racism, and it's actually George Floyd's murder and this physicality and its visibility was actually an impetus for many people to learn more on their own. And I'd say many white people for the first time taking this dive. That said, it's important for people to be able to teach classes with impunity. One of the things, for instance, that the Trump administration was trying to limit was discussions of diversity, to remove funding for anybody who talked about diversity in particular kinds of ways. So until we can all access the complete story and the complete truth, then we can't actually react to it. So I think those are important things to think about. Governmental control, the lack of diversity in any area of our government that then becomes subscribed to limiting not just academic freedom, but people's access to truth. So it's an important sort of circular conversation that we're often involved in. That's why it's important for those of us on the front lines of teaching about race and difference continue to do the work, whatever field we're in and however we are embodied in this particular lifetime.
Right. I have one from Ronnie, and asks, do you feel the occupation of police actually is an encouraging occupation that has a loophole of allowing those who might hold racist views to work and make large amounts of money for committing crimes against communities of color?
Oh, Ronnie, what a loaded and interesting question. Yeah. Your mother's done a great job in making sure that you have an inquisitive and creative mind. That said, as many have already noted, it is impossible to separate police as we know it now from its roots in the slave era and patrolling for people who are just trying to flee for freedom. It also cannot be removed from the ways in which the apparatus of white supremacy actually defined police action for so long. That said, it's necessary that as many people as possible are involved in peacekeeping rather than policing, however you want to say it. It's extremely important for us to retrain police. There's currently a call to defund the police, which really means transitioning some of the social programs from police hands to other hands. Ronnie, I'll add to that dilemma the fact that people with mental health problems actually are at inordinate numbers killed by police when really they are being called often by family members to get help for their loved ones. And so what we have here is all the social problems of our times embodied in a force that's supposed to be able to address all of them. There have been people who have made careers out of making sure that their supremacist notions are visited in their actions as police. But as importantly, there are police, again, embodied in different kinds of bodies who have done just the opposite. I think we'll be in this conversation for some time. And I think there are also people in the middle. There are also people who are in the process of change, who maybe joined in one ideology and now see another one because it's just become clear. But what's important is that we continue to witness and continue to have those uncomfortable conversations so we can reach a point of change that's sustainable.
And I've got one hand up, and I'm sorry if I'm butchering your name, Rashwan or Razwan? Oh, you're muted. I'm so sorry. Can you?
I'm not hearing anything, Karen. Am I just missing?
No. Can you unmute yourself? Here. No. You can also type it into the chat and we can get to your question in a second. I might look at Cynthia's question, and it goes back to something that we talked about earlier with voter suppression laws and documentarians. Is there a connection between voter suppression laws and proposed laws that might happen regarding documentarians?
I expect that to happen in a world where water and food cannot be given in long voting lines, where polling places are closed down, moved away from college campuses, placed in places where there's very little access. But you also have a movement alongside of that where voting is very easy for people who are privileged in various kinds of ways. But yes, I expect that to be the next thing. So I hope that what comes out of this conversation is that we are all mindful and on the watch for things that would limit the reach of citizen documentarians, because the ways in which these things happen actually create opportunities for equality and change.
And I believe Rashwan put in the chat, the 1619 Project is a movement to include Black history into the classroom, which I'm unfamiliar with, if you want to expand on that, Sheila.
Yes, the 1619 Project was one started to place Black history, Black literature, Black being into a wider conversation to address that very question that was asked previously. How do we add to this conversation? How do we build access for people who don't know and haven't had the opportunity to learn? So the 1619 movement has been large and also impactful, but alongside of that was a counter movement. I forget what that one was called under the Trump administration, to exactly decry what was happening in the 1619 Project. I also think it's very important that we have these online collections in terms of Black writing and writing from other communities of color. Because I'll say again, as Chimamanda Adichie said, for those of you who know her work, there's certainly a danger in a single story. And as many stories as we can bring together is how we do affect change.
And I love her so much because I remember listening to a TED Talk that she led, talking about her writing process and identifying that when she was growing up, that there were no authors or no writers that she identified as herself. I always read and I wrote about or thought about people from a white perspective. And it's when I became an author myself that I really explored more of my own identity, which I think is very powerful. And I think is something to think about, not just as somebody of color or of any sort of culture, but just as people in general, that there's so much capacity to learn and explore yourself in different ways.
Exactly. And I do want to leave everyone with a thought, is this conversation is not about white people. It's about the notion of white supremacy and those who want to keep it in place. And so that's the other side of that conversation is what defines whiteness for people who do not identify as white supremacists and who want to move beyond this moment. There's work to do there, because certainly in many, many cases, whiteness has been defined by what it is not. It's not Black, it's not brown, it's not Native, it's not this. And so there needs to be a lot of work around white identities, plural, so that there's something more to the notion of whiteness than an idea of white supremacy.
And I think that's something that we're so excited to explore at the library, is having more conversations like this and to talk more about the role of creativity, of literature, of exploring ethnicity, but also the role of culture and how we can all help each other influence and have conversations. Also, Patsy, I saw your cat and I loved it. Just want to add. Sylvia loved the cat moment. So I just wanted to make sure she had attention for that.
Thank you so very much for this conversation. And for those of you who've actually stayed beyond time, I can't be more grateful to you that we took a moment to celebrate my attempt so many years ago to make a difference. So thank you for making a difference for me, for this program and for your engagement and for its very existence. I certainly appreciate you.
And we look forward to hearing more from you, because as I remember when we first talked a long time ago, you said you had a mystery novel that you were working on involving Zoom meetings. So I hope, yeah. So, you know, more to come.
More later.
Yeah. Again, thanks you everybody for joining us this evening. We will continue this conversation at the library. We hope you can all attend more events like this in the future. We will be following up with the recording, but also with some additional readings that you might want to look into, including things that were discussed within Sheila's books. Again, so grateful that you could all attend. Thank you, Sheila. Thank you, Sylvia.
Thank you.
Everybody who have had questions.
Have a good evening.
Have a good
Thanks
evening,
again.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.